But then how can we really explain, and I'm kind of coming back to this because this is such a confusing thing, how can we explain this enthusiastic support for this bombing of the former opponents of other American interventions?
Because in this case, U.S. propaganda has succeeded in presenting it as a humanitarian endeavor. And a lot of people who are in favor of humanitarian endeavors are just caught up in the propaganda. But if you think it through, it's plain that that can't be the case. For one thing, the bombing sharply increased the humanitarian catastrophe, exactly as was expected. In fact, that was, well, let me just quote the U.S. NATO commander, Wesley Clark. 2 days after the bombing started, he said, "It is entirely predictable that Serbia will respond by expelling people and killing them by more atrocities." So that's entirely predictable. Yeah, and in fact, it's what happened. So in Kosovo itself, the bombing increased the humanitarian disaster enormously. Furthermore, we know, just think, all you have to do is think about it. We know that the U.S. government does not care about humanitarian catastrophes, nor do the people who are getting excited about this. You can see that very easily. I mean, for example, by looking right next door in Turkey, where they have been massively supporting, even worse atrocities. And it takes nothing to stop that support. It's not, you don't have to bomb Ankara to stop the support. Just stop sending the jet planes, napalm, anti-personnel weapons, and so on. That's all it takes.
But this TV coverage focusing on, violence and atrocities, creating impression that everybody knows what's happening now. And even people who a couple of weeks ago couldn't find Kosovo on a map are now totally confident they know enough to demand that we do something. And we have this.
And how many pictures have you had of thousands of Kurdish villages that were destroyed in southeastern Turkey, tens of thousands of people who were killed, 2.5 million refugees, and so on? How many pictures have we seen about that?
Yeah,
the answer is zero, because the orders from Washington are, that's our atrocity, and therefore we don't talk about it.
So then we come to the interesting thing here about what's not on TV doesn't exist, and reality is made by TV. I remember Anthony Lake said about U.S. foreign policy a couple of years ago, just before the war in Bosnia started, that U.S. foreign policy is being driven by CNN and whatever
That's
CNN...
That's complete nonsense, and he knows it. CNN is being driven by U.S. foreign policy, and he knows that perfectly well. It wasn't the choice of CNN to focus attention solely on Kosovo and not look at Turkey. I mean, that was the choice of the U.S. government.
So why do they then just go for briefings to NATO officials or to Pentagon? Don't we have independent journalists who would explore on their own?
There are some, not many. I mean, for example, Jonathan Randall, very fine journalist, long-time Middle East correspondent of the Washington Post. He just wrote a few months ago, came out with a very good book on the atrocities in Turkey and the U.S. support for them. There's occasional journalists who try to, be independent. But overwhelmingly, that's very difficult. But if you want to keep your job, you better follow the line.
I see, but one thing that I really wanna ask you, that's my personal question, because following news from different places like in Europe, one of the dominant elements in the public debate in this country is moral outrage, this angry demand for justice, and from halls of Congress down to average person on the street, angry.
We have to make a distinction between the majority of the American population and the elite educated sectors that are involved in planning and management. They're completely different. So let's take a look back. And we have a ton of evidence on this. I mean, take the Vietnam War again. I mentioned the way it's analyzed by the New York Times, which is quite typical of educated sectors. The war was wrong because it became too costly for us. That's the general view. You take a look at the American population, their view has been completely different. It's been asked on polls regularly since the late 1960s. The most recent one was just a few months ago. People are asked what they think about the war in Vietnam. It's an open question. You don't expect high numbers. But roughly 70% since around late 60s, about 70% have said, I'm quoting, "The war was fundamentally wrong and immoral, not a mistake." Among educated people, that's that's statistically insignificant. Maybe 1%. The standard view is it was a mistake. Well, that's dramatic difference between the general population and educated sectors. And that is found on a lot of issues. As far as the population is concerned, you're quite right about moral outrage. But remember that people have no way to feel moral outrage about Turkey, which is far more important, because here we're directly contributing to it massively, to the atrocities. But people can't feel moral outrage about that because they never heard of it.
One of the things that I have noticed, that even a few of those people that we hear on media who are, outspoken against this war on Yugoslavia, they publicly oppose the bombing, but because it doesn't work.
That's right.
The unspoken
That's very
assumption.
much like Vietnam. If you look back at coverage of Indochina on the part of what are called the liberal media, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and so on, their criticism was it wasn't working. But that's like, as I said, that's like the criticism of made by the German General Staff after Stalingrad.
But what I hear there is that, maybe bombing is not the best method, but some other means will be more effective, but the goal is not in any question.
That's right, because that is the nature of being well educated. It is to accept the framework of power and not to question it.
How can then this non-negotiable assumption of, good goals and intentions of U.S. government be explained?
How can it be explained?
Yeah.
The manner I've just described. But well-educated people understand that that is the position you must assume. So, for example, again, let's just take yesterday's New York Times. They have a major article by one of their intellectuals, House intellectuals, Judith Miller, on sovereignty and human rights, who simply asserts as a fact that the United States has been an aggressive leader in the struggle for human rights. Well, anyone who even pays attention to the most elementary data knows that that's not true. Just look at Amnesty International reports. But that's what you say if you're a well-educated person. There's nothing new about this. What I'm saying is ought to be familiar. So let's take George Orwell. I mean, everybody's heard of Orwell.
Right.
In fact, everyone has read Animal Farm, just about. But ask your listeners how many people have read the introduction to Animal Farm. Well, the answer will be, I can tell you right now, very few, if any. And there's a reason for that. It wasn't published. Why wasn't it published? Well, because here's what it said. Animal Farm was, of course, a satire about the totalitarian enemy, the Soviet Union.
Big Brother.
Yeah, and so, of course, that was wonderful. Everybody had to praise that. But in the introduction, Orwell said, look, he's writing in England, he said, we shouldn't feel so self-righteous about it because England is not all that different. And his introduction was called Literary Censorship in England, Censorship. And he described how in free England, unpopular ideas are suppressed and marginalized and never heard, not by the same means they use in Russia, but he said the result comes out not very different. And then he even gave some reasons. And one of the reasons was pretty much what I've just been repeating. Mm-hmm. He said that well-educated people come to understand that there are certain things it simply wouldn't do to say or even to think. And that's part of the process of education. So yes, you end up with the result that we've been talking about. For a properly educated person, the idea that the United States might not have honorable motivations is just unthinkable. I mean, you can have that idea about every other country in past history or the present world. In fact, you do have it, but not about the holy state. That we just support with dedication of a kind that commissars would be impressed with. That's part of education.
Professor Chomsky, I would like to take few phone calls. Would you be open to taking few, including few of our listeners, so they have an opportunity here to talk to Professor Chomsky? Good afternoon, you're on the air. Please be brief.
You've amply demonstrated why we're not there. In your opinion, why are we there? And since the timing is suspect, is it more than a cover-up to keep Chinagate out of the media?
Thanks for the call.
Okay. It's a good question, a very good question, and it's a shame that it's not being discussed publicly because it's the main question. We can exclude the possibility of humanitarian concerns. That's impossible. So why are we there? Well, here I have to speculate. So far it's been fact. But my speculation is roughly this. Turbulence in the Balkans, no matter of what kind it is a threat to the interests of rich and powerful people. It poses a kind of a danger to Europe and hence to the United States, which is heavily involved in European economy and investment and so on. That means any kind of turbulence in the Balkans becomes what is called a humanitarian crisis. That's a technical term. It means it might threaten the interests of rich and powerful people. In contrast, if people slaughter each other in Sierra Leone or southeastern Turkey or Colombia or whatever, it's not a humanitarian crisis because it doesn't threaten the interests of rich and powerful people. In fact, we're very often involved in it, escalating it. This is a crisis. What do you do when you have a crisis?